The next moral value that we're going to discuss is utilitarianism, an approach to ethics that has a lot of intuitive appeal to many people. The outline, again, is quite simple. First, we'll talk about the nature of consequentialism. Then we'll discuss utilitarianism in some detail, and then move on to a few questions to consider as you are thinking about the case studies and doing the rest of the reading for the week. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. Whereas deontology looks at the intrinsic nature of an action, a consequentialist theory looks at the extrinsic nature of that action. Another way of putting this is that deontologists and virtue theorists, who we'll discuss later, ask whether the action is wrong in and of itself, whereas consequentialisms look purely at the results and ask whether the action aims towards the best possible outcome. One thing you'll find if you pay attention is that often when friends and family are in intractable disagreements, it may be that one is giving a consequentialist argument and the other is giving a deontological or a virtue theoretic style of argument. Utilitarianism claims that the correct action is the one that is aimed at maximizing total or overall utility. In other words, utilitarianism claims that the correct action is the one that makes the world a better place in terms of things that are useful, primarily to humans. Utility is a general term, and it encompasses all of the benefits produced by the action. Now, John Stuart Mill, who is a quite famous advocate of utilitarianism, gives more specifics along these lines. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is based in what he calls the greatest happiness principle. That's the principle that actions are right insofar as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong insofar as they tend to promote the opposite. Notice this language, tend to. We're not held accountable for how our actions actually turn out. What we're held accountable for is our thinking process as we look forward to the various courses of actions that we can take and try to predict which courses of action will have the best influence on the world. Happiness here, by the way, is pleasure and the absence of pain. So it's something that in theory we could quantify. We could add up pleasures and pains of all of those individuals who are impacted by our decision. The utilitarian calculation is the primary way in which a utilitarian will figure out how to act. This is a kind of cost-benefit analysis. You might think that a cost-benefit analysis in this case, since we're looking to maximize happiness, would just involve adding up the amount of pleasure and pain experienced in the world on the basis of the different courses of action that we could take. While this is part of it, Mill also believes that we need to count, in addition to the quantity of pleasure and pain, the quality of pleasures that people experience. Mill believes that pleasures come in different species, that some are intrinsically more valuable than others. In particular, he would say that the pleasures that come about through the use of our higher cognitive faculties are more refined and valuable than the pleasures that come about through the basic bodily desires, food, drink, sex, and so forth. So it's not to say that food, drink, and sex and the pleasures that are achieved more easily don't count. They do count. But when we're doing a calculation, we should consider the quality of pleasure as well as the quantity, and those pleasures that come about through the exercise of our higher faculty will take a certain priority. Another thing to keep in mind when we do a utilitarian calculation is that future people count as well as present people. To the degree that we can pretty well predict that people will exist in the near future, we count them in our calculations if our action is going to have an influence on them. When we talk about environmental ethics, we're going to do utilitarian calculations that take into account people who might be impacted by current decisions about resources and pollution. Likewise, if I'm trying to decide in my personal life whether or not to have children or whether to pursue one career instead of another, I may well have to think about possible future people and how they might be impacted by my decision. Another thing to mention is that when I do a utilitarian calculation, I'm going to add up the pleasure and pain to be experienced by all sentient beings. Remember that what the aim here is to maximize pleasure, to minimize pain. Well, any being, any animal that can experience pleasure and pain then is relevant to our utilitarian calculations and should be included. That said, given Mill's distinction between the quality of pleasure and the quantity, Mill believes that most animals have primarily low quality pleasures, the pleasures that come through various kinds of perception and experiences of the five senses. These count in our calculations, but they'll be outweighed in a particular case by a pleasure that comes from a human being who is using her higher, more developed faculties. The final thing to mention about Mill's utilitarianism is the concept of rules of thumb. Mill does not expect us to do a utilitarian calculation for every decision we make in life. That would be impossible. Instead, we do a utilitarian calculation for those decisions that are important and for which we have plenty of time to choose. We sit down and we balance out all the pleasures and pains that will be created through the various courses of action, think through the probabilities, and come up with a decision. For most situations in life, however, we'll operate based on certain rules of thumb, and we can start with the basic moral principles we were taught when we were young. Mill theorizes that these principles were taught to us because from generation to generation, they tend to be the rules or principles that maximized happiness in the world. So we learn that we shouldn't lie, that we shouldn't steal, that we should work hard, that we should plan ahead. It's a good idea to follow these principles until we have a reason to think that they're not really maximizing pleasure in the world. And when that possibility arises for us, take some time off, do some utilitarian calculations, and refine our rules of thumb. So that's how a utilitarian in the real world will operate. Here are some questions to keep in mind about utilitarianism. Utilitarians say that we should add up the pleasures and pains that might be created by various possible courses of action. Is it right, though, that we count all pleasures and pains, even ones of the same quality, as the same? There are some pleasures and pains that many of us find abhorrent or objectionable. Is it right that utilitarianism counts all of these pleasures the same and would match them up with the pleasures that we find intrinsically valuable? Also, isn't it difficult to quantify, as utilitarianism tells us to do, certain goods about human life, like health, life, and love? Some people are concerned that utilitarian results are too vague. And finally, can utilitarianism deal properly with the violations of people's rights and with treating them unjustly? These objections and others like them are brought up in the text, as well as responses that a utilitarian might make.